Officer Sarah drove down the quiet road, her patrol car slicing through the stillness of the early morning. The town she worked in was small and peaceful, surrounded by thick forests and rolling hills. It was the kind of place where life moved slowly and crime was rare. She enjoyed these routine patrols, where the only sounds were the rustling trees and the occasional chirping of birds. But today, something unusual caught her eye. In the rearview mirror, she noticed movement on the side of the road. At first, she assumed it was just another animal crossing, common in an area like this. But as she continued driving, the movement persisted. Her gaze sharpened, and her breath hitched slightly. A small bear cub was trailing behind her car, struggling to keep up. Sarah slowed down, puzzled by the sight. Cubs usually stayed close to their mothers, avoiding humans at all costs. This one, however, was determined. Its tiny legs moved quickly, trying to match the speed of her vehicle. She pulled over, watching as the cub hesitated before inching closer to her car. Stepping out, she placed a cautious hand on her belt. She had encountered wildlife before, but something about this situation felt different. The cub wasn't behaving like a typical young bear. It didn't seem curious or playful. Its small body trembled, and its dark eyes held something she couldn't quite place. It wasn't just fear, it was desperation. Sarah crouched slightly, trying to assess the animal's condition. It wasn't injured as far as she could tell. Its fur was a bit dirty, and it looked thinner than it should have been, but nothing suggested immediate danger. What concerned her most was its persistence. Most wild animals, even young ones, would flee at the sight of a human. But this cub stood its ground. The bear took a hesitant step forward, then another. Sarah held her breath as it inched closer. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't making any sudden moves. It simply stared at her, its tiny chest rising and falling with quick breaths. Then, to her shock, it let out a soft whimper. Sarah had spent enough time around animals to recognize distress when she saw it. This cub was not just lost, it needed help. But help with what exactly? She glanced around, scanning the trees and the road behind her. No sign of a mother bear. No sign of any other cubs. The little bear was completely alone. She tried to think through the possibilities. Had it been abandoned? Had the mother been hurt or worse? The thought unsettled her. A cub this young wouldn't wander away from its mother unless something had gone terribly wrong. The bear let out another soft cry, breaking her train of thought. Its small body quivered as it stepped even closer, now barely a few feet away. Sarah's instincts told her not to move too fast. Though it seemed harmless, it was still a wild animal, and wild animals could be unpredictable. But as she stood there, watching this tiny creature stare up at her with wide eyes, she felt an unfamiliar weight settle in her chest. There was no doubt in her mind now, this cub wasn't just lost. It was looking for something. Or someone. Sarah exhaled, placing her hands on her hips. She had no experience handling bear cubs, but she knew she couldn't just leave it here. Something had led it to her. Something had made it follow her. And whatever that something was, it wasn't over yet. Officer Sarah remained still, her eyes locked on the cub that refused to leave her side. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the road, the silence stretching between them. Every logical part of her mind told her to call wildlife services and wait for them to handle the situation. But something about the way the cub looked at her made her hesitate. This wasn't just an ordinary animal encounter. The bear wasn't wandering aimlessly or acting on instinct, it had a purpose. Sarah slowly reached for the radio attached to her shoulder. But before she could press the button, the cub let out another distressed whimper. Its small body trembled as it took another step forward, its paws pressing into the dirt road. There was an urgency in its movements, a silent plea that she couldn't ignore. It wasn't afraid of her. It was trying to tell her something. She exhaled and lowered her hand. Her training told her to wait, to let the professionals handle this. But her gut told her something else. She had always trusted her instincts, and right now, they were screaming at her to pay attention. Sarah crouched again, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. The cub's ears twitched, but it didn't back away. It simply stared at her, its dark eyes filled with something she had never seen in a wild animal before: desperation. She spoke softly, knowing the cub wouldn't understand her words but hoping to ease its nerves. Its small body tensed, as if bracing itself for what she might do next. Then, to her complete shock, it stepped forward and reached out a tiny paw, brushing it against her boot. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't normal. Wild animals didn't behave this way. They ran. They hid. They avoided humans at all costs. But this cub had followed her. It had sought her out. And now, it was trying to make contact. Her mind raced. Was it tame? Had it been raised by humans? She dismissed the thought almost immediately. The cub was too young to have been separated from its mother for long, and there were no reports of missing or rescued bears in the area. This was something else. She studied its body language carefully. It wasn't just seeking comfort, it wanted something from her. The cub turned suddenly, trotting a few steps toward the tree line before stopping and looking back at her. Its tiny ears perked up, its body still trembling with urgency. Sarah remained frozen in place, watching as it repeated the motion, a few steps forward, then a glance back at her. It was leading her somewhere. Her heartbeat quickened. Sarah hesitated, glancing down at her radio again. She should call for backup. She should report this. But the thought of delaying whatever this cub was trying to show her made her stomach twist. She glanced around. The road was empty. The town was still sleeping. The trees swayed gently in the wind, the scent of damp earth filling the air. Nothing about the scene looked unusual. Yet she felt the weight of something unseen pressing against her. The bear took another step, pausing only when it realized she wasn't following. Sarah made her decision. She straightened, adjusting the belt at her waist before taking a slow step forward. The cub immediately perked up, its little body tensing in anticipation. It let out a soft noise, a sound that sent a shiver down her spine. Then, without hesitation, it turned and started moving toward the woods. Sarah followed. She stepped carefully as she followed the cub into the thick undergrowth, her boots pressing against damp leaves and soft earth. The morning light struggled to break through the dense canopy above, casting long shadows that danced between the trees. The cub moved with urgency, trotting ahead a few steps before glancing back to make sure she was still following. Every instinct in her body told her that she was walking into something far bigger than a simple lost animal case. The air smelled of damp moss and pine, a familiar scent in these parts. But there was something else beneath it. Something faint. Something wrong. Sarah's grip tightened around her belt as she moved deeper into the woods. She had seen animals act strangely before. But never like this. The bear wasn't just wandering. It was leading her. With purpose. Her breathing slowed as she kept pace with the cub. It navigated the rough terrain with ease, its tiny paws pressing into the damp soil without hesitation. Sarah, however, struggled with the uneven ground. The forest floor was littered with fallen branches and tangled roots. And as she followed the cub deeper into the trees, she couldn't shake the feeling. Something was waiting for her. Each step required focus, yet the cub moved forward as if every second mattered. The farther they went, the quieter the world became. The usual rustling of small creatures in the underbrush had faded. No birds called from the branches above. Even the wind had stilled, leaving behind an eerie silence that set Sarah's nerves on edge. She glanced back, realizing just how far she had come from the road. The trees stretched endlessly in every direction, their trunks forming an impenetrable wall. If she hadn't been following the cub's trail, she might have lost her way already. But there was no turning back now. Then she heard it, a sound so faint it barely reached her ears, but enough to make her heart jolt, a soft, broken whimper. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't the cub in front of her. It had come from deeper within the trees. The sound was weak, fragile, almost lost in the stillness of the forest, but it was there. And it wasn't alone. The cub perked up at the sound, its small ears twitching. Without hesitation, it pressed forward, moving faster now, its tiny legs carrying it with renewed urgency. Sarah followed, her pulse quickening. The whimpering grew louder as she moved closer. It was raw, filled with pain and exhaustion. Her mind raced through the possibilities, but nothing made sense. Then, just ahead, through the tangled branches and thick undergrowth, she saw it, a shape curled against the base of a fallen tree. Sarah's steps slowed, her throat tightening. The cub ran forward, closing the distance between them in seconds. As she drew closer, her stomach twisted at the heartbreaking sight before her. A second cub lay on the ground, barely moving. Its fur was damp and matted with dirt, its tiny body frail and motionless except for the faint rise and fall of its chest. The first cub nudged it desperately, letting out small cries, trying to stir it awake, but the second cub barely responded. Sarah swallowed hard, dropping to one knee beside them. She could see the exhaustion in the second cub's body, the way its sides heaved with each shallow breath. It had been here for a while, alone, weak, barely holding on. Her fingers trembled as she reached out, her pulse hammering against her ribs. She had spent her career helping people, but she had never encountered anything like this. The cub had led her here. It had found her, followed her, begged her to come. And now, she knew why. Sarah knelt beside the tiny, motionless cub, her heart pounding against her ribs. The first cub whimpered softly, nudging its sibling as if trying to wake it up, but there was barely any response. The little body lay curled against the cold earth, its shallow breaths so faint they were almost undetectable. Its fur was damp and matted, its limbs weak and unmoving. The sight sent a sharp pang through her chest. This cub wasn't just tired, it was on the verge of giving up. The first cub whimpered again, pressing its nose against the smaller one's side. Its tiny paws trembled as it tried to stir its sibling, but the second cub remained still. The desperation in its eyes was unmistakable now. It wasn't just asking for help, it was pleading. Sarah clenched her jaw as a deep unease settled in her stomach. Where was their mother? Bears didn't abandon their young unless something had gone terribly wrong. The thought of a mother bear lying somewhere in the woods, hurt or worse, made her pulse quicken. If these cubs had been alone for too long, the weaker one might not last much longer. She forced herself to think logically. She needed to act fast, but she also needed to be smart. Her hand reached for the radio at her shoulder, her fingers curling around the cool metal. She could call for backup, a wildlife team, someone who actually knew how to handle this situation. But the moment she lifted the radio to her mouth, she hesitated. Something about this moment felt different. This wasn't a routine wildlife sighting. The first cub had gone out of its way to find her. It had followed her, chosen her, and now it was looking at her like she was its last hope. Her chest tightened as she exhaled slowly. She wasn't a veterinarian. She wasn't a wildlife expert. She was just a small-town officer on her morning patrol. But in this moment, none of that mattered. She reached forward cautiously, brushing her fingertips against the smaller cub's fur. It was colder than it should have been. The tiny body barely stirred at her touch. The first cub whimpered louder now, its distress growing. Without thinking, Sarah removed her jacket, spreading it out on the forest floor. Carefully, she scooped up the frail cub, cradling it in her arms. The first cub let out a distressed cry, its small paws tapping against her leg, but she hushed it softly, murmuring gentle reassurances, even though she knew the cub couldn't understand her words. The weak cub barely reacted as she wrapped it in her jacket, its breathing slow and uneven. It had lost too much warmth, too much strength. The realization made her move faster. If she didn't act quickly, she wasn't sure how much longer it would last. She glanced around, suddenly aware of how deep she had gone into the woods. The trees stretched endlessly in all directions, their towering trunks blending together in the dim morning light. The sun was higher now, but beneath the thick canopy, the world still felt shadowed and cold. She had walked farther than she realized, and now she had to get back, with both cubs in tow. The first cub pressed itself against her side, still shaking. Its wide eyes stayed locked on its sibling, unwilling to leave its side. Sarah adjusted her hold on the tiny, wrapped-up cub and took a slow, steady breath. She had no choice. She had to get them out of here. She rose to her feet, the weight of responsibility pressing against her shoulders. The first cub immediately followed, padding after her without hesitation. It wasn't looking around anymore. It wasn't searching. It trusted her completely now. Sarah didn't stop to question it. She didn't have time. With one last glance at the darkened forest around her, she turned and began the long journey back. Sarah moved as quickly as she could through the dense forest, cradling the weak cub in her arms while the first cub stayed close to her side. The weight of the tiny creature was barely noticeable, but the weight of the moment pressed down on her like a heavy burden. She had never carried something so fragile before, never been responsible for a life so small yet so significant. Every step felt like a race against time. The cub wrapped in her jacket remained unnervingly still, its frail body barely shifting with each breath. The other cub whimpered softly, its tiny paws crunching against the forest floor as it trotted beside her. It no longer hesitated or looked back. It had made its choice. It was staying with her. Sarah's boots pressed into the damp earth as she maneuvered over fallen branches and uneven ground. The trees loomed high above, their thick canopies blocking out much of the morning light. The farther she walked, the more aware she became of how isolated they were. If something went wrong out here, if she tripped or lost her way, there would be no one to help her. The radio was still clipped to her shoulder, but she resisted the urge to call for backup. Every second she spent waiting for someone to arrive was a second the weaker cub might not have. She had to get them back to her car. Then she could call in the right people. But first, she needed to get out of these trees. The first cub whimpered again, its little body brushing against her leg as if seeking reassurance. Sarah glanced down and gave a small nod, even though she knew it wouldn't understand. She didn't have the words to comfort it, not that words would have helped. The only thing that mattered now was moving forward. Her legs ached as she pressed on, the weight of the cub in her arms growing heavier with each passing minute. She shifted her grip slightly, adjusting the way the jacket wrapped around its fragile frame. The bundle of fur was still warm, but its movements were minimal. That wasn't a good sign. Sarah's heart pounded as she quickened her pace. The edge of the woods had to be close. She had been walking for what felt like forever, but the trees still stretched endlessly around her. The silence pressed in, broken only by the soft sounds of her own breathing and the steady rustling of the cub at her feet. Then, in the distance, she saw it, a break in the trees. Sunlight spilled through the gaps, illuminating a familiar stretch of dirt road. Relief surged through her chest as she pushed forward, her feet moving faster. The first cub kept pace, its energy renewed now that they were almost out. As she reached the clearing, she spotted her patrol car exactly where she had left it. The sight of it made her stomach unclench slightly, but there was no time to slow down. She hurried to the vehicle, yanking open the door with one hand while carefully lowering the wrapped cub onto the passenger seat. The first cub jumped up, scrambling inside as if afraid to be left behind. Sarah grabbed her radio, her voice steady but urgent. She reported the situation as quickly as she could, giving her location and requesting immediate assistance from wildlife rescue. She didn't know how much time the smaller cub had left, but she wasn't taking any chances. She turned back to the tiny creature on her seat. Its breaths were still too shallow, its body too weak, but it was here now, out of the forest, no longer alone. The first cub curled up beside it, resting its head against its sibling's side. Sarah watched them for a moment, her chest tightening at the sight. It had done everything it could to save its sibling. It had fought to find help, refused to give up. Now it was her turn to do the same. Sarah sat behind the wheel, her fingers gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. The weight of responsibility sat heavy on her chest as she glanced at the two cubs on the passenger seat. The first cub remained curled beside its sibling, its small body pressed close as if trying to share its warmth. The weaker cub lay motionless, wrapped securely in her jacket, its shallow breaths barely visible. She took a steady breath and turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, breaking the uneasy silence that had settled inside the car. She didn't waste another second. The tires kicked up dust as she pulled onto the road, her gaze flicking between the empty stretch ahead and the fragile creature beside her. Her radio crackled as dispatch responded to her earlier call, confirming that a wildlife rescue team was being sent to her location. But she didn't have time to wait for them to reach her. The rescue center was on the outskirts of town, about a 15-minute drive away. She could get there faster than any team dispatched to the scene. She pressed down on the gas pedal, forcing herself to stay focused. The road was quiet, the forest on either side of her blurring past. She had driven these back roads 100 times before, but never had a drive felt this long. Every passing second felt like a countdown she couldn't control. The first cub let out a soft whimper, shifting its tiny frame to nudge its sibling. Sarah glanced over briefly, her chest tightening at the sight. It was worried. It could sense that something was wrong. She tightened her grip on the wheel and pushed forward. The rescue center wasn't far. If she could just make it there in time, if they could just hold on a little longer, there was still hope. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, casting golden light across the landscape. The town came into view in the distance, but she barely registered the familiar buildings as she sped past. The only thing that mattered was getting to that rescue center. Her radio crackled again, the voice of another officer coming through. They had received her report and were offering to send additional support. She barely responded, muttering a quick acknowledgement before flipping the siren on. The wailing sound broke the morning calm as she raced through the quiet streets. Finally, up ahead, she spotted the Wildlife Rescue Center, a modest building surrounded by open land, with enclosures and rehabilitation areas stretching behind it. She had been here before, responding to occasional calls about injured animals found near the roads. But never like this. She pulled into the gravel lot, tires skidding slightly as she threw the car into park. Before she could even reach for the door handle, 2 rescue workers were already rushing out, alerted by her siren. Sarah wasted no time. She scooped up the wrapped cub and stepped out of the vehicle, moving quickly toward them. The first cub scrambled after her, refusing to be left behind. "They're in bad shape," she said, her voice tight. "The little one barely has any strength left." The workers nodded, immediately taking the fragile cub from her arms. One of them unwrapped part of the jacket, checking the cub's condition, while the other turned toward the first cub, who hesitated but didn't run. Sarah exhaled, watching as the professionals took over. The weaker cub was carried inside, disappearing behind the center's doors. The first cub lingered at the threshold, its tiny frame frozen with uncertainty. Sarah crouched beside it, placing a steady hand near the ground. "They're going to help," she murmured, unsure if the cub could understand her voice but hoping it could at least feel the reassurance. The cub hesitated for a moment longer. Then, with one last glance at her, it stepped forward and followed them inside. Sarah remained outside for a moment, staring at the door that had closed behind them. She had done everything she could. Now all she could do was wait. Sarah paced outside the rescue center, her boots crunching against the gravel as she glanced at the door every few seconds. The morning air had warmed, but she barely noticed. Her mind was locked on the fragile cub now in the hands of the wildlife experts. She had done her part, but an uneasy feeling sat deep in her stomach. Would it be enough? The first cub had disappeared inside with the workers without hesitation, as if it knew this was where they needed to be. That thought alone made Sarah swallow the lump in her throat. The little one had never given up, had fought to find help, had done everything in its tiny power to make sure its sibling wasn't left alone. She took a deep breath and leaned against her patrol car. Her shift had technically ended, but she wasn't leaving, not yet. She needed to know if the cub would pull through. Minutes stretched into an hour. The doors remained closed, and no one came out. Her fingers tapped anxiously against her belt, a habit she had developed on long stakeouts. She tried to push down the uncertainty, to remind herself that this was in the hands of people who knew what they were doing, but patience had never been her strength, and right now, every second felt like a lifetime. Then, finally, the door swung open. One of the rescue workers stepped outside, wiping their hands on their uniform before making their way toward her. Sarah straightened immediately, searching their face for any sign of news. "It was close," the worker said, their voice carrying a weight of relief. "But the little one is stable for now, severely dehydrated and malnourished, but we've got fluids in, and it's responding. It's going to take time, but we think it has a chance." Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. A mix of relief and exhaustion hit her all at once. She had spent her career responding to emergencies, saving people in desperate situations, but today had felt different, more personal, more fragile. "And the first cub?" she asked, glancing toward the door as if expecting to see it appear. The worker smiled slightly. "Hasn't left its sibling's side. It's been watching over it the entire time, like a little guardian. Whatever bond they have, it's strong." Sarah's chest tightened. That tiny cub had fought so hard, had refused to leave its sibling behind, had trusted her with something so precious. And now, after everything, it had finally found the help it had been searching for. She nodded, rubbing a hand across her face before glancing back toward the center. "Can I see them?" The worker hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Come on in." Sarah followed them inside. The air was cooler, the scent of antiseptic and fresh hay filling the space. Soft sounds of other recovering animals drifted through the building, but her eyes immediately locked onto the enclosure at the far end of the room. Inside, the first cub sat curled protectively beside its sibling, its small body pressed close, offering warmth and comfort. The weaker cub was bundled in soft blankets, and 4 drip running beside it. Its breathing was still shallow but steadier now, stronger. Sarah exhaled slowly as she stepped closer. The first cub lifted its head at her approach, those dark eyes meeting hers once again. For the first time since this started, there was no desperation in its gaze, no panic, no pleading, just trust. Sarah crouched beside the enclosure, resting her arms on the edge. "You did good," she murmured, her voice softer than she expected. The cub blinked slowly, then nestled closer to its sibling. Sarah stayed there for a long time, watching as the tiny, fragile life she had feared wouldn't make it now had a second chance. Days passed, and Sarah found herself returning to the rescue center more often than she had planned. Each time, she told herself she was just checking in, making sure the cubs were adjusting, but deep down, she knew it was more than that. The moment she had locked eyes with that tiny bear in the woods, something had shifted inside her. She had spent years working as an officer, responding to distress calls, helping people in moments of crisis, but this felt different. The first cub had stayed by its sibling's side every day. The bond between them was undeniable. Even as the weaker cub slowly regained its strength, the other refused to stray too far, always curled up beside it, watching over it like a tiny guardian. The rescue workers marveled at the connection, calling it one of the strongest displays of loyalty they had ever seen. Sarah wasn't surprised. She had witnessed it firsthand. The once fragile cub was stronger now. It no longer struggled to lift its head or breathe properly. It had started to eat, small bites at first, but enough to keep going. Sarah had worried at first that it wouldn't make it through those first crucial days, but the cub had fought, just like its sibling had fought to find her. One afternoon, as Sarah stepped into the rescue center again, one of the workers greeted her with a knowing smile. "They're asking for you," they said, nodding toward the enclosure. Sarah's eyebrows lifted slightly, but she didn't question it. She made her way inside, stepping toward the familiar space at the end of the room. The first cub was already waiting for her, ears perked up, eyes watching her intently as she approached. It lifted itself onto its small paws, pressing closer to the edge. Sarah crouched down, resting her arms on the barrier. "Hey there," she murmured. The cub didn't hesitate. It moved forward, pressing its nose against the space between the bars. A soft, familiar sound escaped its throat. It wasn't a cry of distress. It was something gentler, a recognition. Sarah exhaled slowly, her lips curving into a small smile. She reached out, letting her fingers hover just close enough for the cub to sniff them. "You did good," she whispered. "You saved your sibling." The second cub, still weaker than its companion but no longer fragile, lifted its head slightly from the blankets. It blinked sleepily, shifting in its nest of warmth. It was recovering, slowly but surely. The rescue workers had already made plans for the cubs. Once they were strong enough, they would be moved to a larger rehabilitation facility, where they would be raised with other rescued cubs, away from human influence, preparing them for a future back in the wild. Sarah knew it was the right thing, the best thing. But still, a part of her felt something tighten in her chest at the thought of saying goodbye. She remained there for a while, watching as the first cub eventually curled back up beside its sibling, its tiny body a shield of warmth and protection. It trusted her, but it belonged in the wild. It had always belonged there. As she finally stood, stepping back from the enclosure, she let out a slow breath. The cub had found her that morning on the road for a reason. It had led her through the trees, shown her something she never could have found on her own. It had placed all its trust in her hands. And now, she had done everything she could. One of the rescue workers joined her as she stepped away, watching the cubs with quiet admiration. "You know, I don't think I've ever seen a case like this before," they said. "That little one, it wasn't just looking for help. It knew exactly what it was doing." Sarah nodded, her gaze lingering on the cub one last time. "Yeah," she murmured. "I think so too." She stepped outside into the warm afternoon light, inhaling deeply as she felt the weight of the past few days finally settle. The cub had found her for a reason. And now, it was exactly where it needed to be. As she climbed into her patrol car and pulled onto the road, she took one last glance in the rearview mirror at the rescue center disappearing behind her. Then, with a small smile, she focused on the road ahead. Because some stories, no matter how unexpected, always find their way to the right ending. If you were moved by this incredible story of loyalty and survival, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming and unforgettable tales. Every like, comment, and share helps us continue to bring you the best stories from around the world. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.